Shema Koleinu. Hear our voice. It's a prayer to Hashem. What is that? Sorry, hearing an odd noise. Oh, it's the fan of my computer. Sorry. Anyway, Shema Koleinu. Hear our voice. Listen to our prayer. Have compassion on us. 2021, off to a rocky start in America. Please, God, shower us with the blessing of peace in the United States and around the world. And we say, Amen. How are you, my holy? And that was, of course, Rabbi Shlomo Katz singing an awesome song from his album, Live in Melbourne. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? It's fantastic to be learning together. If you've been glued to the TV all day, this is so much better. Let's get into our counter-programming and learning together by lighting up the darkness. Okay. Wow, I've never had that fan on be so loud. I hope it's not disturbing our audio. Okay. Where am I? All right, we have 2 dedications tonight. Very nice. Here we go. Sheila Brester, who is often here in our classroom and became a monthly donor, which is wonderful for us. All nonprofits rely on support, and having income regularly is beautiful. So thank you so much for that, Sheila. And your dedication is to Accidental Talmudist. I'm going to take that on behalf of our whole organization and Nina and all the amazing work that she does. Our assistant Brian, our webmaster Erez, our marketing team at Cause Inspired Media, and everyone else that we work with. Thank you so much, and may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings in all your worthy ways. And we have a dedication. Okay, so I want to get this one right. Okay, so this is dedication from Sarah Bas Miriam and her husband, Yehuda Leib Ben Sima. Now, Sarah Bas Miriam made this dedication actually in honor of her friend for a shidduch, that her friend should find her soulmate and be able to come to the chuppah to get married. And so to her friend, to Sarah Bas Miriam's friend, may Hashem smile on you. There's a saying in the Talmud that it's easier to part the Red Sea than to bring soulmates together and create a couple. So we invoke God's help. That Sarah Bas Miriam's friend should find her shidduch, should find her b'shert, her intended, and they can get their family started. And we say Amen. But also, since Sarah made this this donation and dedication, she contacted me, and she and her husband have COVID. So we are praying for you, for Sarah Bas Miriam, and for her husband Yehuda Leib Ben Sima, that you both have a refuah shlema, a complete healing of body, mind, spirit, and everything in all your ways. You should be completely healed, and soon. It should be as fast as possible. And may the Holy One shower blessings on you and your husband and your whole family. And we say Amen. I was a little verklempt. I haven't even welcomed who's in our classroom tonight. Let's see. Melissa in Great Neck, Stephen in New Hampshire, Pauline in Arkansas, Sharon in New Jersey, Nancy in North Carolina, Renee in Indy, Isabel in el Distrito Federal de Mexico, bienvenida. Cristo in Lubbock, Texas, Sandy in Michigan, Pam in Nashville, Marjorie says shalom from, of all places, Georgia in the USA. Tom in Pennsylvania, Lucy in Minnesota, Chris saying shalom from Wisconsin. Bill says, shalom everyone. Since I imagine I'm not the only one who found today stressful, I want to share a section from my Traditions prayer book, from lightning and tempest, from earthquake, fire and flood, from plague, pestilence and famine. Good Lord, deliver us. Amen. Amen, Bill. Peter says, back from Vermont and in Livingston, New Jersey. Valerie in Oregon. Nina said amen to Bill as well. Carolyn is wishing us all peace. Sharon's got a prayer. Hi, I'm here from Charlotte. Arnold is saying a beautiful light in the darkness. Fantastic. Rochelle, a welcome release from the day's events. Joe says amen. Patrice, Renee. Okay, everybody's in conversation. There's a lot of amens in conversation. I love it. I love when the community is chatting with each other. It's great. Anne is here from Merced, and Linda says shalom from Wyoming. Over there on the YouTube side, Sheila. I welcome you and read your dedication tonight. Sheila from Montana and Neil from Virginia. Okay. Lots to do. Where are we holding? This is Daf Mem Vav. This is page 46 in Tractate Pesachim, the fourth volume of the Talmud, the laws of Passover. We're in chapter 3. Tonight, we're completing our discussion of Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 3, and beginning and completing the discussion of Mishnah 3 and opening our discussion of Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 3. So let's get into it. As we started to talk about yesterday was the kneading bowl, right? So imagine a wood bowl for these purposes, a big bowl in which somebody is kneading the dough during the year. They knead their dough in it to make bread. So right away you can imagine, is this bowl going to be permitted to be used on Passover? And the general rule is no. I mean, for sure this thing has got chametz in it. He was making dough, or she was making dough in it during the year to make regular bread. But as we saw, with respect at least to in the Talmud, now maybe the halacha changed a little bit later. Maybe some sages, said it a little different, because generally speaking today, a bowl that you make dough in during the rest of the year, that goes in the garage with the other chametz. And is unavailable during Passover. However, if a person only has this one bowl and they're not going to have bread if they can't use this bowl, then it's going to be permissible, assuming that they can get it ready for Passover. And interestingly, as we saw yesterday, even if there's a little bit of dough in it, but if that dough is in the cracks and it really has become part of the bowl, and in fact, it helps keep the bowl together. It reinforces the strength of the bowl, maybe when it has cracks. Then the sages are going to permit that. There were a couple of different opinions, whether if it's less than a kezias, less than an olive volume, then it's just de minimis, it's nullified, we don't worry about it. Or if it's more than an olive volume, then no matter whether it's in the cracks or not in the cracks, it's too much, and that, unless we can remove it, it can't be used at Passover. Today we continue that discussion, the discussion of that Mishnah, with the second part of the Mishnah, which is talking about where the Mishnah says, and similarly, this dough in the kneading bowl, whether it's in the cracks or not in the cracks, is going to have an effect with respect to tumah, to ritual impurity. And the way that it's elucidated in the Koran Talmud by Rav Steinsaltz is that what the Mishnah is talking about is whether that dough that's in that bowl, which remains in the bowl, right, because the person just leaves it in there. So if the bowl contracts impurity, for instance, the carcass of a sheretz, a dead creeping thing touches it, so now it's tameh, and you needed to make it tahor, ritually pure, because you were going to bake some bread in it, make some bread out of this dough and give it to a priest when the temple is standing. As challah or as teruma, it has to be in a state of tahara, ritual purity. So if so, and the bowl became tameh, so you would want to immerse it in a mikvah, a ritual bath, in order to purify it of its ritual impurity so that you can continue to use it for this process. So the point is that when you immerse something in the mikvah, whether it's a toivel mikvah where we immerse vessels and utensils, or when we immerse our own bodies in a mikvah, there can be no interposition between what is being immersed and the waters of the mikvah. So if this bowl has dough on it, kind of encrusted into it, so the question is that an interposition between the bowl and the water of the mikvah that would invalidate the immersion in the mikvah? That's the question that is being asked. And the Mishnah seems to be saying that if the person wants the dough to be in there because it's in the cracks and keeping the bowl together, well, then it's considered part of the bowl and it does not interpose between the bowl and the water of the mikvah when we do an immersion to purify it of ritual impurity. On the other hand, if the person, if it's just a dirty bowl and they simply haven't cleaned it properly and they're intending to remove that dough, but it's not their intention that dough in the cracks becomes part of the bowl so that it reinforces the bowl, right? If the person is not thinking that way, but rather it's just a dirty bowl, then the dough does interpose and invalidates the immersion in the mikvah. So the question is asked immediately by the sages of the Gemara, how is this comparable to the first paragraph of the Mishnah? In the first paragraph of the Mishnah, we said that whether or not there's too much dough in that bowl and fulfilling a function in that bowl, whether it's reinforcing the bowl or just in the bowl, but it's going to be affected very much by whether or not there's an olive bulk in there, a kazayas, right? The volume of one olive worth of dough. That's going to be the measure that's going to determine whether we're going to qualify, or not for the outcome of that first paragraph of the Mishnah. And here in the second paragraph, with respect to tumah and immersion, it doesn't matter what the amount is. It could be a whole lot of dough, but if it's all stuck in the cracks and the person wants it to stay there because it reinforces the bowl, then it's fine. It doesn't interpose in the immersion. On the other hand, it could be very little, less than an olive volume, but if it's, he's not intending to leave it in there, it's not reinforcing the bowl, then it will interpose. So with respect to chametz and Passover, we have a liability for transgression of owning chametz during Passover is going to be determined at least in part by the amount of dough. And with respect to the immersion in a mikvah to purify that bowl of its tumah, of its ritual impurity, it's going to be depending on the intent of the owner. Amount versus intent. So says the Gemara, those two things are totally different. Why are we adding this paragraph and talking about immersion when in the first paragraph it was all about amount? When here in the second paragraph, it's all about intent. These are not comparable. They can't be the same law. Therefore, hold on a second. So therefore, what are we going to do with that? There seems to be a contradiction. If these laws are meant to be grouped together, and they are in this one Mishnah, it must be, says Rav Yehuda, that there's a mistake. There were words omitted from the Mishnah when it was recorded. And we should rewrite the Mishnah. And what it should say is that, okay, in the first paragraph, depending on the amount, that minimum amount, is there an olive's volume or not? That's going to determine whether we're going to be liable for having chametz on Passover, leavened dough in our possession during Passover if we keep that bowl in our possession. But with respect to immersion and tumah and immersing in a mikvah, it is not like that, right? He would add the words, with respect to tumah immersion, it is not so, right? Rav Yehuda would add, it is not so, because in this case, intent is dispositive, whereas amount was dispositive in the first paragraph. Abaye will object strongly to Rav Yehuda and say, you can't rewrite the Mishnah and add these words, and in this case it is different, or in this case it is not so. You can't do that because the Mishnah itself said similarly, meaning in that Mishnah, right, it talked about whether you have an olive bulk or not. And it mattered a little bit about whether, hold on a second. Yeah, it was really about amount. It's in the cracks of the mixing bowl. And according to the first paragraph of the Mishnah, it was really, do you have an olive's volume or not? And then it says, and similarly, with regard to the laws of immersion for ritual impurity, and then it talks about intent, right? So the question is, well, the first one was about amount. The second one is about intent. But why does the Tana of the Mishnah introduce that second paragraph by saying, and similarly? Since he did say, and similarly, you can't come along and say, and in this second case, it is not similar. You can't do that, says Abaye. So instead, suggests Abaye, you need to understand it a little bit differently. Rather, what we should say is, during the rest of the year, we only look at the intent, right? If the person intends to keep that dough in the bowl, filling the cracks, reinforcing the bowl, then it's part of the bowl and we can immerse it in a mikveh and not worry about that dough that's in there. But if he's intending to clean it out and he just hasn't cleaned it yet, then it would interpose and it would invalidate the immersion in the mikveh. That's during the rest of the year. But during Passover, says Abaye, during Passover, we do look at the amount. And it doesn't say in the Mishnah, by the way, and similarly with respect to tumah and immersing in a mikveh to purify ourselves from tumah. Rav Steinsaltz adds that elucidation. What the Mishnah actually says is, and similarly with respect to tumah, right? Just with respect to ritual impurity, we look at the intent of the owner, whether he intends to keep it there or not. So says Abaye, what the Mishnah means is that during Passover, with respect to tumah, and tumah means not only ritual impurity, but the idea that if something is tameh, it is ritually impure, it is impure and it can transmit its impurity. Right? If it is impure, but it is of like a third degree or a fourth degree tumah, then it is not capable of transmitting that impurity, so we would call it disqualified rather than tameh. But here we're talking about whether something can transmit that impurity. So what Abaye is saying is that if there's enough dough, let's say that some tameh food, something that was tameh, some food, let's say some dough, that was ritually impure, but it was less than an egg volume. And an egg volume of food is the minimum measure for tumah. It's the minimum measure for it to become tameh and then transmit that tumah. It's a bigger measure than the olive volume that we've been talking about for liability of owning chametz during Passover. So let's say that we've got some dough that is tameh, but it's less, just a little bit less than an egg volume. But then it comes into contact with this dough that's in the bowl. And there's enough dough in the bowl that it would combine with this other dough that you didn't have quite enough of it, but it was definitely tameh. It was definitely, it was ritually impure. And now combining with what's in the bowl, you would have that egg volume and it could transmit its tumah. So during the rest of the year, says Abaye, whether or not we could actually combine with the dough that's in the bowl would depend on the owner's intent, whether he views the dough that's in the bowl as just reinforcing the bowl and it's become part of the bowl, or whether he views it as just it's a dirty bowl that has some dough in it, and that dough would combine with this other nearly minimum amount for tumah, near the minimum measure of dough that's tameh, to now constitute the minimum. And now if it touched other tahor food, right, say a ritually pure food, now this combination of what was tameh plus the dough in the bowl now makes the minimum measure. And if it touched this other food that was not tameh, that was tahor, that was ritually pure, it would transmit the impurity to that other food. And then it would have triggered that impurity. But during Passover, we don't look at the intent. During Passover, we look at the minimum measure in the bowl. And if it's less than an olive volume, it's insignificant. If it's more than an olive volume, it is significant, and it would combine with this other, near minimum measure of tameh food to be able to transmit that tumah. It's a long-winded way of explaining that idea. Especially because Rava comes along and says, Abaye, what are you talking about? That's crazy. The Mishnah didn't say anything about combining measures in order to transmit tumah. Did it say anything about combining? No, of course not. The Mishnah was not talking about tumah and whether it's going to be transmitted or not because of minimum amounts. The Mishnah was talking about interposes. It says in that second paragraph, and similarly, with respect to tumah, if the owner intends to keep that dough in there, then it interposes. And if he doesn't, then it does not interpose. That's why Rav Steinsaltz added the language about immersing in the mikvah, because interposing suggests an immersion in a mikvah. So says Rava, since we're talking about interposing, what this must mean is that during the rest of the year, if you have this bowl and the owner wants the dough to stay in the cracks because it reinforces the bowl, then it does not interpose when you dip it in the mikvah. If it's just a dirty bowl and he's intending to remove that dough when he immerses, if you immerse a dirty bowl, then the dough does interpose and it invalidates the immersion. But during Passover, now we have to look at the amount, right? If it's less than an olive volume, it does not interpose. If it's more than an olive volume, it does interpose. And that seems like a pretty logical, sort of understanding the second paragraph in light of the first paragraph and the fact that it's here in Tractate Pesachim, the laws of Passover. Rav Papa actually says, well, interpose does not necessarily suggest that we're talking about immersion in a mikvah. Actually, interpose simply means interpose, coming between two things. So Rav Papa says what's actually going on here is, let's say you have the carcass of a sheretz, the carcass of a creeping thing. This is a strong source of tumah, of ritual impurity. So the creeping things are defined in the Torah, but imagine it can either be a small rodent or certain kinds of insects, and it's dead, right? It's a carcass, and so if it touches that bowl, the bowl becomes tameh. The bowl becomes ritually impure, and then if the bowl comes into contact with food, it can transmit that impurity to the food. But if there's dough between the wood of the bowl itself and the creeping thing, the dead creeping thing that comes into contact with it, that's where we ask, does it prevent the bowl from becoming tameh or not? Right? And you would say, well, doesn't the food become tameh and then transmit its impurity to the bowl? We're going to leave that question aside for a second. There's cases that we can come up with where it would not. But the point is, if the dough is part of the bowl, well, then it doesn't interpose between the creeping thing and the bowl, and if it touches it, the bowl became impure. But if the dough is not part of the bowl, then it can be said to interpose between if the creeping thing touched that dough and it didn't touch the wood of the bowl, now there's an interposition and it doesn't transmit the impurity to the bowl. And during Passover, instead of looking at the owner's intent, we're going to say how much dough is in that bowl. More than an olive volume, it interposes. Less than an olive volume, it does not interpose because it is nullified. And that is how we understand the second part of Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 3. We move on. Now we're looking at Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 3 on page 46 of Tractate Pesachim. Let us read the Mishnah. Very short Mishnah. Deaf dough. Already it's like, what? What does that mean? Deaf dough, like dough that cannot hear. Deaf dough is dough for which it is difficult to determine if it has been leavened or not. It is comparable to a deaf mute who cannot communicate. Obviously, deaf mutes can communicate, but I guess sign language didn't exist back then. It wasn't like people could so easily have a pad of paper to be writing. much, much harder for a deaf mute to communicate 2,000 years ago. And the point is that this dough is not communicating to us by looking at it, maybe even by feeling it, whether it has leavened or not. So we're not sure if this dough is leavened or not. So if there is dough similar to it, in that water was added to both at the same time, and it became leavened, then the deaf dough is prohibited. It's leavened, meaning this is during Pesach, right? During Passover, when we're not permitted to have leavened dough in our possession. But you can still make bread. It just has to be unleavened bread. It needs to be matzah, right? So you were making some bread, and then you had 2 batches, and one of them definitely became leavened, and so you're going to have to get rid of it. And the other batch, you're not sure if it became leavened or not, but it was made at the same time, so you're going to have to assume, yeah, since the first batch became leavened, the second batch must have become leavened as well. Although it has not shown external signs of becoming leavened, it can be presumed that the deaf dough has also become leavened. That's the Mishnah. The Gemara seeks to clarify the ruling of the Mishnah. If there is no dough similar to it, right? Like, so there's dough, we're not sure whether it's leavened or not. Okay, one answer is if we made another batch and it definitely became leavened, then we know that this one became leavened. And presumably if there's another batch and it did not become leavened, then this one also did not become leavened. But if there's no other batch, so then what do we do? So if there's no dough similar to it, what is the law? Rabbi Abahu said to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, according to the sages, leavening occurs in the time that it takes a person to walk the distance from Migdal Nunaya to Tiberias, or Tiberias, which is a mill, which is equivalent to 2,000 cubits. Now, a lot of laws are going to come out of that little paragraph. Let's just read one more paragraph and then I'll explain. The Gemara asks about this formulation. Why is it necessary to mention the distance between these two places? Let us say that leavening begins after the time it takes a person to walk a mill. And the Gemara answers, well, this statement incidentally teaches us that the length of a mill is the distance from Migdal Nunaya to Tiberias. So, where is Migdal Nunaya and where is Tiberias? Tiberias is on the Sea of Galilee. It's a town that's on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And Migdal Nunaya is 1 mil away. So it's, 1 mil, it's 2,000 cubits. It's about 3,000 feet. It's about a kilometer, more or less. And you could see right here, that's the map of the Galilee. I don't think this is going to be focused, but maybe you could see it. So that's a map of the Sea of Galilee, and there's Tiberias and the southerns to the south, and Migdal Nunaya to the north. So the distance between them is about a kilometer, about 2,000 cubits. And what they're saying is, so you mixed this dough with water, you kneaded it, and then you let it sit. In about how long are we going to assume that it leavened if you let it sit before you baked it? And the answer is the distance it takes a person to walk 1 mil. The time it takes a person to walk the distance of 2,000 cubits. How much time is that? So the sages and later commentaries will disagree on that. There's a few different numbers that are proposed, but the biggest ones are. So the time it takes to walk a mil. Does it say who suggests what? So some say that it is 18 minutes. Others suggest that it is 24 minutes, while others rule that it is 22 minutes. The last one is the Gra. The Vilna Gaon says that it's 22 minutes. But since there's 3 measures, either 18, 22, or 24 minutes, because it's such a big transgression to own chametz during Passover, the sages have traditionally ruled with the most stringent of these opinions, which is 18 minutes. So it's from this ruling right here, this Mishnah and the commentary on it, that we get the law that matzah means that the dough was kneaded and then it was allowed to sit for no more than 18 minutes before it went in the oven. If it takes longer than 18 minutes to go from kneading to in the oven, it's considered leavened and it's disqualified as matzah. Rather, it's leavened bread, it's chametz, and it's prohibited to even own it during Passover. 18 minutes, and we get it from here. And 18 minutes is about the time that it takes to walk from Tiberias to Migdal Nunaya. And now that we're learning about these two towns, we're just going to mention that Migdal Nunaya is just next to, there's a town there now called Migdal. And in 2009, there was a salvage dig that was done by the Israel Antiquities Authority prior to the construction of a hotel, right? It's a lake shore, it's a shorefront property, right? This is like a town right on the Sea of Galilee. That's a very populated area. There's a lot of hotels around the Sea of Galilee, and they were going to dig a new one. But in Israel, anytime you're putting up a new building, so the Israel Antiquities Department has to come and make sure that you're not going to be covering up or destroying ancient artifacts. And when they did that inspection here in Migdal, they found a synagogue that was 2,000 years old from the Roman era. And they even found a stone that was part of that synagogue that had the 7-branched candelabra there, like the menorah that stood in the ancient temple, in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. An amazing find. I'll hold up this picture. I don't know if it's going to be capable of being seen, but it was like that stone there, and it has that candle, that 7-branch menorah there. Unlike the Chanukiah, the menorahs that we light at Hanukkah, which have 9 branches, right? And with respect to Tiberias or Tiberia, there's just so much to say. It's so important, in Talmudic thought, that I'm just going to read this whole note, and it's actually a lot of information quickly, but this will just give you some idea of why Tiberias or Tiberia is of such great importance. So Tiberia is a city on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. It was founded by Herod Antipas in approximately the year 18 of the Common Era. It was apparently constructed on the site of earlier settlements, and according to some opinions in the Talmud, at Megillah 6a, it was the site of the biblical city of Rakat. At the outset, Tiberia, was a town with a mixed Jewish and Gentile population, and the Jewish population was not distinguished for its Torah scholarship. However, after the destruction of the temple, so that was, some saying the year 69, some saying the year 70 of the Common Era, about 52 years later, then the city was created by King Herod. However, after the destruction of the temple, several prominent Torah scholars lived there, such as Ben Azai and Rabbi Meir. Tiberia reached its apex when the Sanhedrin moved there in the year 235 of the Common Era, and it became the seat of the Great Council presided over by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. After him, so he was the editor of the Mishna, and after him, Rabbi Yochanan became its leading spiritual figure and headed the yeshiva there, at which point Tiberia became the Torah center of the Holy Land for many years. Most of the disciples of Rabbi Yochanan, particularly those who emigrated from Babylonia, lived and continued their studies in Tiberia. Reish Lakish lived there, as did Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat, Rabbi Ami, Rabbi Yirmiyah, and Rabbi Yonah. And it is likely that most of the Jerusalem Talmud was redacted there. After the Talmudic period, Tiberia remained a significant creative, religious, and spiritual center. Many of the works of Aggadic Midrash and numerous liturgical poems were composed there. During the post-Talmudic era, the inhabitants of Tiberia were renowned as experts in Hebrew grammar. The system of Hebrew vocalization still used today is called Tiberian vocalization, as it was formulated and established there. So when you look at Hebrew with vowels, like in the Torah, there's no vowels, but in a Hebrew grammar book or in a prayer book that's made easier for people who are not so familiar with the Hebrew, the vowels are included, and that system was developed, in Tiberias. So you can see why the sages are mentioning it's so important to them, right? So if you can just, it's better than generally saying the time it takes to walk a mil, which is about 18 minutes. You could say, it's the time to walk from Tiberias to Migdal Nunaya. A little bit better, certainly more colorful. Okay, so Rabbi Abahu said in the name of Resh Lakish, right? Resh Lakish, who was teaching in Tiberias, he was the study partner of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Abahu said that Resh Lakish said that there are 3 items where we use this time measure, not the time it takes a person to walk 1 mil, which is, let's say, 18 minutes, but the time that it takes a person to walk 4 mil, so that's about 72 minutes. And what are these matters in which, the 72-minute time limit, or the time it takes a person to walk 4 mil, what are these matters? Number 1, it's the amount of time the dough may be kneaded and not rise. So we said after you knead the dough, if you leave it there for 18 minutes or more, it's considered to be leavened. But you can be working the dough. When you're working the dough, it's not rising, right? You're working it. But if you work it for more than 72 minutes, then even though you're still working it, it's going to be considered that it rose, that it's leavened, and it'll be disqualified as unleavened bread for Passover or for offerings on the altar. Second, this is the distance that a person needs to walk this is how far you need to go if you need to immerse before you pray. In other words, if a person is in a state of ritual impurity, this doesn't apply so much today, but certainly if he was going to go to the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, or he, for some other reason, needed to be in a state of purity in order to pray, and he is personally impure because he touched a creeping thing or a dead body, or he had an emission of certain liquids from the body. Then, if he can get to a mikvah within a 72-minute walk, he's obligated to go immerse in that mikvah before he goes and prays in the temple or wherever else he's going to pray, where he needs to be in a state of purity. But if he has to walk further than that, then he's released from that obligation. And also, for a person to wash his hands before praying anywhere or before eating. Eating meaning that you're eating a meal, and what is eating a meal? Eating a meal means that you're eating bread, right? So if you have a lot of food but there's no bread, it's considered a snack. If you only have a little food but part of it is bread, then it's considered a meal. And then you have to wash your hands and say a bracha, recite a blessing, then make a blessing over the bread, and then you can eat it. Well, what if there's no water available for you to wash your hands before you eat or before you pray? Now, before praying, you don't have to say the blessing. Before eating, you do. But you are obligated to wash your hands before praying, even today. Before praying at home, before praying in a synagogue, you have to wash your hands, assuming that thoughtlessly you might have touched some part of your body that is normally covered, or you scratched your head. What were the 3 things? Hold on a second. If you went to the bathroom, if you touched some part of your body that's covered, normally covered, or if you scratched your head, then before praying, you are obligated to wash your hands. Now, what if water is not immediately available to wash your hands? How far do you have to go out of your way to get that water to wash your hands before you pray? 72 minutes. You have to walk 72 minutes. But then it's Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Hanina, who clarifies, if you're on the road, okay, and you'd like to pray, but there's no water available for you to wash your hands, but within 72 minutes of being on this journey, like in the direction that you're going, then you can delay praying until you can get to the place where there's water so you can wash your hands. If you have to go back the way you came or just out of the way, like a detour, a total detour out of your way, so it's not 72 minutes, it's 1 mil or 18 minutes, right? So as long as you can get yourself to a place to wash your hands within 18 minutes or less, then you are obligated to wash your hands, no blessing, before praying. Before eating for sure, but when you wash your hands before eating, you also say the blessing. But again, 18 minutes out of your way to wash your hands before you eat or before you pray. If it's going to be a 19-minute walk, and then you could ask, well, what about driving? Do I have to drive? And the answer seems to be, however you're going to get yourself to this water so that you can wash your hands before you pray. If it's going to take you 18 minutes or more, then you're excused. But if you're going to do it in less than 18 minutes, you have to wash your hands. And I apologize, I'm not sure if it's 18 minutes exact. For less, for sure you have to wash. More, for sure you don't have to wash. If it's 18 minutes exactly, I think that's included in the stringency. And so if you can get to water in 18 minutes exactly or less, you need to wash before praying or eating. And then one more measure is added. And who's the one who adds this? This is Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. Very interesting. So if you're making leather, right? Let's say you are a tanner. A tanner is somebody who turns cow hides or other animal hides into whatever you're going to use the hide for, like leather, right? Like you're going to make, for example, you're going to make it into a leather coat. The ancient world, a leather hide could also serve as a table because everyone's sitting on the floor and this nice leather hide becomes the table that they eat off of. But that leather is the skin of a cow. So right after the cow is killed, you could skin it, right? But that skin from the cow is part of the carcass of the cow. If you touch that, that's going to transmit tumah. That's going to transmit ritual impurity. But the tanner, when he starts working on it, right, after he's been working on it, smoothing it, treating it, whatever it is that he's going to do with it to turn it from cow skin into leather, once he's 72 minutes, the time it takes a person to walk 4 mil, once he's 72 minutes into that process of converting cow skin into leather, it becomes no longer a piece of the carcass of a cow. It becomes something different. It's leather, and it does not transmit ritual impurity. That's the end of our discussion of Mishnah number 3. We're just going to introduce Mishnah number 4. We're going to read it and just open the discussion. We're going to continue that tomorrow. So if you've got questions or comments, get them in there now. I'm coming to you. Okay, Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 3 of Tractate Pesachim. How does one separate challah? So remember, challah, today, that word, we use it to mean the bread that we eat on Friday nights by our Shabbos dinner or Shabbos lunch or, anywhere you're eating it, we think of it as a kind of bread, right? That kind of braided egg bread, etc. But what challah actually means, it's the piece of the dough or even of the baked bread, if we didn't do it when it was dough, that we separate as a gift to the Kohanim, the priests of the Jewish people. They are born priests, right? They're not rabbis, priests, Kohanim, meaning that they are qualified to serve in the Holy Temple when the Holy Temple is standing, and even today qualified to give the Kohanic blessing, the priestly blessing to the Jewish people. So how does one separate challah in ritual impurity during the festival day of Passover, right? So we have an issue that if you're going to give a gift to the Kohen, to the priest, he can only receive something that is tahor, ritually pure. If this dough becomes tameh, so it's disqualified, you can't give it to the priest. But if it's already been separated as challah, and it can't be given to the priest, then it needs to be destroyed. It needs to be burned. And that's a problem because we don't want to burn something during the festival day itself. That's something we don't do on the Passover day or on any festival day. Ordinarily, one may separate ritually pure challah from dough and give it to a priest immediately so that he may eat it. Ritually impure challah is unfit for a priest and must be burned. Yet it is prohibited to bake or burn anything that is not fit to be eaten during the festival day. We've said this a few times. You cannot cook on the festival except for the festival, right? Cooking is permitted on a festival, but only for the needs of the festival. The one exception to that is when a festival immediately precedes Shabbos, it's permitted to cook on the festival for the needs of Shabbos. But you cannot cook on a festival for something that you're going to plan to eat after the festival is over on a regular day. And that also applies to burning this tameh challah, right? It's ritually impure tameh, therefore it's unfit to give it to the priest. It needs to be burned, but that's considered like cooking, and you can't do that for something that you're not going to actually eat on the festival. That's the issue. However, it is also prohibited to wait and burn it after the festival day. Why? Because it will become leavened, right? So you're making this dough, you're planning to make matzah out of it. You separate a piece for the priest, that's the challah. As soon as you separate it for the purpose of giving it to the priest, it's consecrated. You can't do anything with it except give it to a priest. Somehow it became tameh, became ritually impure, and now you have this dilemma. You can't give it to the priest because it's tameh. You can't burn it because it's the festival day itself, and we can't, burn or cook things except for the needs of the festival, and we don't need this thing for the festival. We just need to get rid of it. But you can't let it sit there because you just kneaded dough, separated this challah, it became impure, but now you've got this chunk of dough that you're not going to bake in the oven with the rest of your dough for your own bread. So if this is dough that you kneaded and now it's just going to sit in your kitchen for more than 18 minutes, it's going to become leavened. And if it becomes leavened and you're a Jew, then you transgress the prohibition on owning leaven during the festival of Passover. That's the dilemma. What do we do? Rabbi Eliezer says, a woman should not designate it as challah prior to baking. Rather, so all of the dough is tameh. A regular person can eat it. Doesn't matter if it's ritually impure. Only the priest cannot eat it if it's ritually impure. So a woman should not designate it as challah prior to baking. Rather, she should refrain from doing so until it is baked. Even after it's baked, you could pull out the part for the priest. Now you could pull it out and just put it aside, and you'll burn it after Yom Tov, after the festival day on the first day of Passover. And then you're not burning something that's not for the needs of the festival. You'd be doing your duty, burning something that the priest can't take, but you wouldn't be doing it during the Yom Tov itself. You could do that during the intermediate days of Passover, but not on the first day. So in other words, she should wait until she has baked all the dough, and then there's no risk of it becoming leavened while it's sitting there waiting to be disposed of. Only then should she separate the challah from it. The portion of challah may then be kept until after the festival day when it may be burned. Ben Betera says she should separate the challah before she bakes it, but then she should dump it in cold water, which will prevent it from leavening, right? It's better to separate challah when it's dough rather than after it's baked. You're afraid it's going to become leavened, but if you put it in cold water, says Ben Betera, it will not rise. It won't become leavened. Rabbi Yehoshua says this leavened bread that it's going to become leavened if you pull out this challah dough and just let it sit there. According to Rabbi Yehoshua, even if it leavens, you won't be guilty of transgressing the prohibition of having leavened bread in your possession. Why not, right? I made the dough in my kitchen. I pulled some out for the priest. It's just sitting there in my kitchen. It's going to be there more than 18 minutes because I can't bake it for my own needs. It belongs to the priest. It's going to become leavened. For sure, it's going to become leavened. So how is it that I don't transgress the prohibition? Says Rabbi Yehoshua, because that challah is not yours. It no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the priest. It's been consecrated. It doesn't belong to you. It's not in your possession. You're not guilty of a transgression. So why doesn't Rabbi Eliezer agree with him? Why doesn't Rabbi Eliezer and Ben Betera, who's Rabbi Eliezer says you should bake it and then put it aside so it won't leaven. Ben Betera says you should put it in cold water so it won't leaven and be leaven in your possession. Why don't they agree with Rabbi Yehoshua? The difference between them, my Benehu, what is between them, is that Rabbi Yehoshua says that the benefit of discretion has no monetary value. What? What did you just say, Sal? The fact that you have this challah, you set it aside for priests generally. It's consecrated as challah for priests. But you need to give it to a priest. You need to choose the priest that you're going to give it to. And there's value in that. You get to choose which priest you're going to give it to. And there's value in having that choice, being able to designate the priest you're going to choose. Says Rabbi Eliezer, that has value. The fact that I can choose which priest and the fact that I could change my mind, as we'll learn tomorrow, in both those cases, there's something of value in that challah that's on my kitchen counter, and therefore I would be guilty of possessing it if it becomes leaven. According to Rabbi Yehoshua, it's designated for priests. You don't own it. The fact that you can choose which priest is very nice, but that has no monetary value, so you don't actually own something during Passover, and you wouldn't be guilty of transgressing the prohibition on possessing leaven during Passover. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let us see if there are questions or comments. Okay. All right, hold on a second. Nina said she can't access the YouTube side, but it appears that there are no questions on the YouTube side, so that's fine. Over here from Facebook, Peter Engel, the sages never anticipated a KitchenAid mixer when they wrote this tractate. I assume you're commenting on the idea that you can knead the dough much faster with the KitchenAid mixer. Right. They did not anticipate that. Bill Eldridge. Now I'm imagining a scene in the heavenly yeshiva where God has one of those brought in to demonstrate and the whole room goes dead silent. I assume that's Bill commenting on Peter's comment. I mean, there's so many things, right, that in the ancient world they never could have imagined. Maybe the most important of all is transportation, right? And the fact that we can go so far in such a short time, unimaginable to them. So, for example, one question that often comes up is there's something we do called bench gomel, right? Which is during the Torah reading, which is done on Mondays or Thursdays, or it could be done on Shabbos as well. In normal times when we have services together in synagogue. So there are certain situations that lead you to recite an extra blessing because you've been saved, right? You've been saved from calamity. You've been saved from death. You've been saved. Like if you were very ill and, like you were hospitalized for COVID and then you get out, you can bench gomel. If you were in a car accident that was very dangerous and you really could have been killed and you feel like it's a miracle that you weren't killed, you can bench gomel. One of those situations, right, is when you go on a trip across the sea. In the old days, that was very dangerous. If you got in a ship and went out to sea, no guarantee you were coming back. They were so at the mercy of the elements in those rickety wooden boats. Now we cross seas all the time. And it's, statistically incredibly safe to go on an airplane and go across an ocean. So the question was asked, do we bench gomel for making that trip? Since it says that if we go across the sea, we should do that blessing. So does it count when we get on an airplane? And generally the sages, the modern halacha is, if you go on a trip over land, you don't bench gomel. If you cross an ocean, you do. Not every community has the same rules about that, so if you're curious about this, I would definitely look up the halacha, see how it applies to your situation, and talk to your rabbi if possible. Rochelle, does it need to be a mikvah? We have used a large stream, and my mom had a rain barrel. What are we talking about, Rochelle? Does it need to be a mikvah for what? Are we talking about a toivel mikvah to purify your utensil, your bowl or your utensil. I guess that's probably what you're talking about. And whether the immersion in that mikvah will purify it or not. So these days, when do we toivel? Really, when we're bringing a utensil or a vessel into a Jewish home, and we just do that at the outset, and generally it's new. But, if you buy these things used from someone else, so it might have, it might have had some dough in it, etc. Now, does it have to be a mikvah? Well, for it to be a proper toivel, it has to be a toivel mikvah. You can use a regular mikvah that people immerse in, but there are mikvahs that are not good for people that are good for toiveling, for immersing utensils and vessels into them. But I don't know, I don't know if a rain barrel would count, or a stream. I need to look that up, The ocean for sure. A river, no, unless you're near the source of it. So I think a stream, yes. Rain barrel, very interesting. Because I think the idea of a mikvah has to be fed by rain. So it might work, but I'd have to, you got to research that question a little bit more. You're not getting an authoritative answer from me. And remember, everybody, I'm not a rabbi. So I'm doing the best that I can based on my research. But I am no kind of authority, right? So I answer questions as best I can, but I always remind everybody I'm not a rabbi. Okay. And Peter finally says, what does Rashi say on this in terms of koshering the bowl? I'm not sure what Rashi says on that. I don't know. If I can find it really fast, I'll look. See, this is one area where the art scroll is a lot handier than the Koran. So with regard to koshering the bowl, what does Rashi say? I mean, there's a lot of different questions that are coming up. I think you're asking about the general. I mean, there's a lot of Rashis in this daf and in this section, and then about whether it's about combining or not. I'm not sure I have the answer to your question, but if I go back to the Mishna, what is the Rashi on our Mishna? So that's going to be notes 27 through 31. The Mishnah seems to mean as follows. If they're calling it a trough, that's interesting. No, they call it a kneading trough. Okay, but the kneading bowl. So if the bowl was tameh, and it had to be immersed to make it tahor, to make it ritually pure, then a piece of dough adhering to it, if one objects to it, in other words, he intends to remove it, it's just a dirty bowl, not in the cracks to strengthen it, he intends to remove it from the bowl, it will constitute a foreign substance that interposes between the water of the mikveh and the bowl, thereby invalidating the immersion, and that is according to Rashi. And so Rashi is also going to go with the simple meaning that if it's sealing the crack, then it will not interpose. If you have a more specific question that you're looking for the Rashi, we can look that up. All right, that's what I've got for us today. Tomorrow is Thursday. May it be a more peaceful, less interesting day, worldwide. But it should be a fascinating day in our learning, God willing, at the regular time Thursday. Today's Wednesday. We're already en route to Shabbos, so we can already start saying good Shabbos. You should all have a great Shabbos when it comes in on Friday. Of course, our Friday class is at noon Pacific. Tomorrow, Thursday's class at 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.